Hello, everyone. Welcome to the long-awaited return of the 240p Club.
Yay!
This is episode 27, and we're going to a strange dimension for our October podcast here. Hopefully not the only one we do in October.
Hopefully not.
Yeah, we've been rather busy. Yeah, really busy, actually. I've been working a lot. Ray started a new job, so he's been working a lot.
Yay.
And Nikki is a happy student and going crazy doing student stuff.
Exercise physiology, biology, and
Taekwondo again.
Taekwondo, yep.
So she's prepared to kick your ass again.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, it's October. October is the month of Halloween.
Woo!
Halloween is not just one day at the end of October. We like to stretch it out for an entire month, especially in the video game industry, because, a lot of people like to cosplay, so you don't really need to do that on Halloween, although Halloween is a great excuse to do that.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, for me personally, because I like to cosplay, I don't know if I can call myself a cosplayer yet, but, I'm just someone who likes to cosplay.
You could call yourself a cosplayer. You earned
I have earned it. So, yeah, basically,
Yes.
I'm a cosplayer.
Yes.
So, which also kind of leaves me at a dilemma. What do I wear for Halloween?
You could always dress as yourself in Halloween. And,
Yeah, I could. That's boring.
Yeah, I know. There might be pictures, but I told all of these cats in this room to get me gothed out for Halloween. That's what I'm doing. Because I listen to some goth music. I listen to more metal, so I lean towards that way, and never really did the goth thing even as a teenager. So it's okay, make me look pretty goth for Halloween, and I'll leave the fashion choices up to Miss Nikki over here and my wife Melissa in the corner over here, our behind the scenes gal. She waves hi.
I will make you look real nice.
Okay. Anyway, let's introduce everyone. I introduced Nikki here.
Yep.
We have Ray in the corner here.
Hello, I'm still me.
Ray is still Ray. And I'm Italian Joe. Of course, I do nothing special, except dress as a goth on Halloween, apparently.
Yeah.
I'm adding that to my repertoire. Alright, anyway, what does this have to do with video games? Nothing, but it leaves you a philosophical dilemma. We've all sat on our toilets, in the shower, wherever we do the absolute best thinking, and we come up with just random shit, not literally shit, because, sitting on a toilet. Let me rephrase that. We come up with random nonsense in our brains, wondering, hey, what would life be like if this happened instead of this? And, of course, this is a blast to do with the video game industry.
Definitely.
So, without further ado, we came up with a few what-ifs for our next podcast here. Alright, and basically, here's how this works. We discussed, this is all theory. I don't have any sort of evidence to really back this stuff up, but you know what?
Screw it, we'll do it anyway.
We're just gonna do it. We're just gonna go with the cuff. Now, mind you, this might, count as parody. None of these are from any real, these are based off real ideas that may or may not have happened in the video game industry, but didn't for some reason. But here is, we'll start from the beginning, actually, here. There was talk between Nintendo and Atari back in 1985, because Nintendo was trying to import its family computer into the United States. It was launched in 1983 and was a success in Japan. But Nintendo really wanted to break into the North American video game market like Atari did back in 1979, 1980. However, though, there was this big video game crash in 1983. It affected North America, really, thanks to a lot of Atari's bad business decisions, and some really bad games were released for this system. Nintendo was absolutely determined not to follow Atari's fate. So, they decided they were going to market the Famicom, which later became the Nintendo Entertainment System, and they approached Atari for said system, just to market it. Atari agreed. They had the paperwork drawn up. Nothing was signed, though. And the 1985 Consumer Electronics Show happens, where Nintendo was in the building. Atari saw what Coleco was doing, and there was a version of Donkey Kong for the ColecoVision. Thinking Nintendo double-crossed them, Atari said no way to that deal and called the whole thing off. Nintendo, they hammered it out about over the next month with a Nintendo, and Atari, and realized it was all a big misunderstanding, and Atari was ready for Nintendo to sign that paperwork. However, they ran out of money. Nintendo would have been committing suicide as a company by signing that agreement, so they shelved it and decided to market the system themselves. Nintendo's business practices have long been discussed. However, I think it's safe to say we would not be talking about the NES or really video games for a long time without Nintendo deciding to say, fuck it, we're going to market it ourselves. So, our first what if is, what if Atari actually did bring the Nintendo Entertainment System over to America?
Now, are we going by the theory that Atari never crashed, or that did...
Well, Atari has crashed, restructured a couple times, but Atari's focus, we're a computer company, computer this, computer that. Nintendo, the Famicom was bright red and white. It looked like a toy. The NES was redesigned to look like a VCR. So, it was meant to not be just a standard toy. It was meant to be marketed as an entertainment system. Something like that. When you look at the name, you don't think of the Atari at all. You're thinking of something completely separate. So, in this sense, depending on who had the marketing, Atari may or may not have decided to try to market the NES as a computing system. So, we have that. It might have gone that route. But, Nintendo, one of their main business practices, the thing that kind of separated them for Atari, was this thing called the seal of quality. They only sold certain amounts of development kits for the NES, to certain companies. You were limited as to how many titles you can release as a company, and most games required Nintendo's approval, called the seal of quality, which a lot of retailers would not carry games that did not have that seal of quality. Why? Because this is what killed Atari. There was a lot of shovelware put on Atari. A lot of developers designed, anyone could really design for the Atari computing system. And the market became so flooded with shit titles that, that's one of the reasons why it crashed. There were so many games out there, half of them were shit. Back then, you didn't have the internet to tell you what was shit and what was good, so... Atari, I don't know if they would have done the same business practices marketing the Nintendo Entertainment System. We might have wound up with a system that lasted a few years, but wound up suffering the same fate. Now, can you imagine in 1991, after, Atari manufactured the Nintendo, it fell apart, would we all be playing Sega Master Systems?
It's a good question. It's a possibility. Considering, they were the big major rival of whatever Nintendo was doing at the time.
Yeah, but they didn't really enter the console wars until about 87.
Right, yeah. But either way, it's a big possibility.
I have heard that the Sega Master System was actually fairly popular in Europe.
It is. Europe, it was really popular. Brazil wound up being extremely popular. Australia, all those places. Like, you know, it wound up being a massive success to the point where games were still being made for the Sega Master System long after the Genesis was out. But would we be talking about the Sega Master System in the light we would be talking about the NES had Atari marketed the NES and committed some of the same errors that doomed the Atari 2600?
I believe we possibly would. I mean, had the NES just completely, like, came out, you know, put out whatever games they wanted to, and then crashed and burned, then yeah, of course there's always that one system that just kind of up out of.
And that's the thing with the 1983 video game crash. Companies were scared to put out systems because they thought there was no interest in them, and they were kind of right. I mean, the computer industry didn't crash at the time. You know, games are still being made. You know, Atari had computers. You had the Tandy. You had the anything IBM compatible. Commodore 64 was still fairly popular at the time. So, you know, games were coming out for computing systems. You know, in '83 and '84, it was just like a home console, something marketed exclusively for games. Was basically you were taking a huge chance. So had Atari marketed Nintendo into the ground, you know, would they be taking the same chance? In 1989, had Sega released the Sega Genesis?
Oh, good question. I don't know the answer to that.
No one does. This is why this is fun. This is what ifs. What ifs.
Mm-hmm. It depends on how successful Atari would have been, just based on name alone.
I like to think, because Atari was kind of infamous for making bad video game controllers, what if they just scrapped the classic D-pad, which is now ubiquitous, and made their own, like, crappy Atari 5200 style replacement controller for it?
Oh, God. Can you imagine, like, you know, joysticks were basically, you know, that just modeled for the arcade and for PC. Like, the D-pad, though, for platformers, especially a game like Super Mario Brothers, I'm sure you would get used to a joystick after a while, but you're picturing the Atari 2600 joystick with, like, the buttons on the top and everything, and you're wondering, how would you be able to control Mario pinpoint accuracy without a D-pad?
Oh, jeez, I don't even think I want to imagine it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Although, I mean, some people are very creative. I mean, didn't they say someone beat,
Yeah, someone decided to speedrun Cuphead
on a DDR pad.
On a Dance Dance Revolution pad. Videoed this and was successful at it. So people, the lengths people will go for video games is unreal. However, most consumers at the time would not have appreciated an Atari-style joystick playing Super Mario Brothers. Hell, Nintendo didn't even bring over Super Mario Brothers 2 to this country until 1993.
Yeah, not until it was re-released as the Lost Levels, I believe.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they figured, you know, U.S. gamers would be too hard for U.S. gamers, and it wasn't enough of a difference from the original Super Mario Brothers. So, hence, that's why that never was released here. Which is crazy, you know, because, you know, we could do that another what if. What if that was released here? I think, you know, it probably would have derailed a bit the Mario franchise until 3 came out. It's people thinking, oh, this game's way too hard.
Yeah, and I know, like, a lot of people nowadays, they really enjoy a challenge. Like, going back to discussing Cuphead for a second, like, with how difficult it is, but people are playing it like crazy and loving every second of it. But you have to also understand, like, what was the gaming mentality back then? Did they appreciate the hard games as they do now?
Back then, also, a lot of the gamers doing this to Cuphead were kids. They were little kids. A 4-year-old holding an NES controller. Granted, you know, like, coordination comes a little later. Mm-hmm. But can you imagine a 4-year-old playing this, constantly dying? They're going to get, especially today's youth, they're going to get bored with this quickly.
Oh, definitely.
Nintendo knew this. That's why they never released anything that difficult. Mm-hmm. But they still released a few challenging games for the people, you know, the more hardcore gamers. And of course, you know, some of the third-party games were infamous for some of the challenges infamous.
I hope none of you were 4 years old playing Ninja Gaiden.
Oh, man. I was 8 years old playing Ninja Gaiden, and yeah. Thank God Nintendo controllers were extremely durable. You can slam a Nintendo controller on the ground, pick it up, it will still work. Yes, I've done of that quite a bit playing Ninja Gaiden. Oh, man.
Yep.
But I would go back and play Ninja Gaiden this very second.
Absolutely. So would I.
Yes. It was a well-designed game if, the spawn rate was just obscene. But, yeah, that's our big what if. And since we did go into 16-bit territory there, what if Genesis didn't? What Nintendo doesn't?
You mean like Nintendo ever would release Echo the Dolphin?
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Yeah.
But, yeah, no, in 1989, 1990, even like going to 1991, before Sonic came out, Sega was, well, they were a far cry number 2 in the video gaming industry. Like, so when Sonic came out, that sold a boatload of Sega Genesis systems. However, before that time, they were a sharp number 2 to the Nintendo Entertainment System, because Nintendo's strength of software. But that didn't stop Sega. They released the ad campaign, what Genesis does what Nintendon't. Mm-hmm. It was usually like a 3-page ad, in black print, and it's just you turn the page and bam, there's all their software titles, and oh wow, look at the graphics, 16-bit, that's awesome. Of course, PC Engine was being marketed here as the TurboGrafx 16 at the time, so you had another 16-bit system with some strong software as well. However, they didn't have the money Sega had, apparently. But, yeah, that's neither here nor there. So the Genesis did what Nintendon't. And what happens if the Sega Genesis didn't actually do what Nintendon't? I.e., they just continue to make shit arcade ports and nothing else for their system.
You have to wonder also, would Streets of Rage have been a better port than the Super Nintendo version of Final Fight?
Yeah, I could picture Streets of Rage winding up in the arcade. It was a game, screaming for the arcade, but never wound up there. It wound up being directly to the Sega Genesis. And that was the thing. I don't think it would have stood out a bit in the arcades, but not too much, because at the time, Street Fighter 2 was out. Everyone was throwing quarter after quarter into Street Fighter 2. They weren't worried too much about Final Fight at the time. Mm-hmm. Although, you seen your lonely double dragon machine in the corner of the arcade, you're going to go play it. Yeah,
if no one else is playing, then yeah, you find something to play.
Absolutely. But yeah, no, Sega had some great arcade titles. Golden Axe was a good one. Hang On, I believe, was a arcade title, if I'm not mistaken. It was a racing game. It was okay. But yeah, Sega's platform was they weren't releasing every game geared towards kids. So they had a few more graphic games, some gory games came out. Obviously it was highlighted with Mortal Kombat coming out to the system, but
with the blood code, yeah.
Yep, the blood code, but let's be realistic. Some Sega games were definitely marketed towards kids, some weren't really quite. Herzog Zwei was definitely not marketed towards kids. I could attest to that because as a kid I had no fucking clue how to play that game. I rented it and I was just like, what the hell do I do? I'm lost here. But yeah, you get the idea. Nintendo had a very strong software library. Sega also had a pretty strong software library, but they were putting out a bunch of different games than Nintendo was. What if the Sega Genesis stuck with just arcade-style shooters and went boof after a while? Like Sonic never came out because the Genesis never reached that point.
The Genesis will not have survived as long as it did then.
No, especially without Sonic.
No.
No way.
I mean, I know, back then, they're, when they first kind of started off the Genesis, I know they had Sonic as a mascot. And they also had the Echo the Dolphin as a mascot as well.
Echo the Dolphin, yes.
Yeah.
What about Alex Kidd, though?
I think that was their first attempt at a mascot.
Yeah.
Alex Kidd, but that was a popular Master System title, so they just made a 16-bit title. I think it was a launch title, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, there's always an answer back to something, like...
Yeah, what would have happened if Genesis didn't? What would have happened if, let's say, 1991, right before Sonic was ready to be released, the system completely fizzled out?
Oh, good question. Who would have put out Sonic then?
Yeah, would Sega
Would
have...
Sonic even be
Would Sonic
a thing?
exist? Mm-hmm. Would Sega have gone to a game designer? And what would a Sonic title look like on the Super Nintendo?
Wow. I don't
And
know.
also, the Super Nintendo, you figure... Super Nintendo's coming out anyway. Let's just be flat out. Like, that system was bound to come out. Nintendo had it developed, etc., etc. I don't think it would have came out as quickly. I think it would have came out in 1992 sometime.
Yeah, I think without the Genesis being around, they would have just put out the system, like...
Whenever.
Yeah, because they didn't have any competition.
Well, the TurboGrafx was the competition at the time.
Well, yeah.
And which ironically beat out the Genesis, I think, in Japan. But not here. You know, because they never really had the marketing, you know.
It's all about marketing.
Yeah. But that's an interesting thought, you know. Would the PC Engine be the second system?
Ooh.
Would
At that
Sega
point,
be
who had computers?
Exactly. But here's the thing with the PC Engine. It was two 8-bit processors. It wasn't like a true 16-bit system. You know, even the CD peripheral, the Turbo CD, aka the PC Engine, PC Engine CD. Or, eventually the Turbo Duo, which was like the two systems in one. I don't know if that would have reached the number 2 in this country due to the software, but I think it may have. But it wouldn't have lasted as long, especially with Nintendo's 16-bit system out, and Nintendo's graphics, and especially their sound processor. You know,
I mean, one could argue that Sega had, like, the much better sound processor.
no, they didn't. The Super Nintendo had the better sound
Well, of
processor.
course, yeah.
It's just
it depends
it's
on
what
the soundtracks, too.
yeah, it's what the developers did with the Sega soundtrack.
Right.
That was basically a stroke of genius. Yeah, the Super Nintendo had a way stronger sound chip. It was just what the designers did with the Genesis sound chip that made them special. Like Streets of Rage 2 wouldn't have sounded any better on a Super Nintendo, I think, just because it was designed for that Sega, the Genesis sound chip.
And Lost Vikings had a better soundtrack on the Genesis as well.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I guess so. I've played the Genesis version. I've never played the Super Nintendo version, so I don't even know. Also, no, as far, like, by that point, like, head-to-head games, Super Nintendo was kind of winning just about every one of them. Apparently, the Lost Vikings was better on the Genesis, and so was Earthworm Jim. Earthworm Jim is just fantastic to play on the
Beavis and
Genesis.
Butthead was also a lot more difficult on the Sega.
Yeah, you know what it is, because it was a completely different game. Beavis and Butthead for Super Nintendo was a generic platformer. For the Genesis, it was I hate to use the term RPG, but it actually required you to use your brain.
Very ironic for Beavis and Butthead.
Yeah, it required you to use your brain to figure out some of the puzzles to pick up some of the tickets.
Goodness.
It was interesting. Every item did something here and there, you had to figure out the best way. Yeah. But yeah, no, Genesis was vastly superior game. So that was one of the titles that was, and also sports games. Genesis was known for their sports games. Nintendo didn't even catch up till about 95, 96. So there's that.
And even then, they had that generic Super Bases Loaded. Remember that game?
That was terrible.
Oh god, I actually have it. I had Super Bases Loaded.
Although they did have Ken Griffey Jr.'s baseball game was pretty good on the Super Nintendo.
I had Goal also for the Super Nintendo.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, that actually was a pretty decent game.
Yeah, Nintendo. And he also had Nintendo World Cup. That was a competing game, which I've never played, but it looked interesting. It looked cutesy, the cutesy Nintendo look,
Which one had Mega Man Soccer?
Yeah. So apparently that's what Nintendo. That's apparently what Genesis didn't, would Nintendon't? If that system went away, would Sega be developing games for the PC Engine, and would the PC Engine still be around? Chances are no, but they probably would have upgraded the system to something different, and we would have kicked off the 32-bit wars a little early.
I think, which also brings up the next question. Had the Genesis not even come out, or had the Genesis failed, would they have put out the Dreamcast any earlier?
Well, they had the Saturn before the Dreamcast.
Right, of course, but, Dreamcast was like the big...
Yeah, that was Sega's last hurrah, really. Mm-hmm. But here's the thing with the Dreamcast, actually. I think Sega stopped developing titles for this because there were really no piracy safeguards on the Dreamcast. At that point, CD burners became pretty commonplace. So anyone can download the appropriate software off your FTP, whatever FTP, or even just go into an IRC chat and find all kinds of wares and stuff. And you can basically turn your Dreamcast into whatever system you want. I had a friend that had 2 DVD discs with all sorts of Nintendo games. It was weird playing it with a Dreamcast controller, but yeah, you could play just about anything for the NES. Mm-hmm. So, that was why that system was kind of doomed.
It had a great library, though.
It did have a great library for the short time it was around. Mm-hmm. So did the Saturn. The Saturn had a good library, especially like Capcom fighting games, although half of them were imports. But, you imported the Japanese version of Children of the Atom. It played like a beauty on that system.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is sad what happened to Sega.
Games.
Yeah. But yeah, no, that's what killed the Dreamcast, CD piracy and everything, which I think spurred Nintendo a bit to, Nintendo was trying to go against the grain for everything, so that's where their GameCube system came about, the idea for the GameCube. They needed, obviously, a disc-based system because that was what killed the Nintendo 64.
Right, they were still using cartridges where everyone had moved on.
Yeah, and that killed a lot of developers. Square left because they didn't want to develop for a cartridge-based system. They moved to Sony. Sony PlayStation killed the marketing shares. Like, Nintendo was seen as an afterthought. Like, everyone owned a Nintendo 64. They wanted to play GoldenEye. But the serious gamers owned the PlayStation or Saturn.
I mean, can you imagine something like Final Fantasy VII on a cartridge? Like,
it wouldn't work.
No.
It would be horrible.
It would not be powerful enough.
You wouldn't have that FMV, the full motion video, and it would be massively expensive. Like, you'd be spending $120 for a single cartridge.
Yeah.
Whereas, Square put these on 3 discs, and you wound up paying, I think it was still $79.99.
But I mean,
retail.
You paid for 3 discs, though.
Yeah, it was 3 discs.
Yeah.
It was developed, manufactured cheaply, let's put it that way, because CDs were cheap to manufacture. Mm-hmm. And, the system enabled, full motion video and all this. Even with, a 64 disc drive coming out, that would have never worked. Mm-hmm. So, actually that spurred Nintendo on, seeing the failure of the Dreamcast, their GameCube system, they had to go to disc. So they, released these little tiny GameCube discs that we all know nowadays. And because they were so scared of piracy. The Wii, same thing. And the same thing with piracy, although people did figure out how to jailbreak it eventually. The Wii U, same thing. This kind of why it fell apart. The Switch, almost the same thing. And also the NES Classic and the SNES Classic, if you think about it. Because, hackers already figured out how to pirate those, put pirate games on them. And, yeah, it turned into, Nintendo was always scared of doing stuff like that.
Yeah, that's probably one reason why they put out so little, so many copies of a certain system.
Yeah.
You know this kind of stuff is going to happen.
Yeah, but that's the thing. Even PC gaming, everything, you have to expect it at this point. People are going to figure out how to hack it, mod it, etc. Skyrim embraced it. People were modding the game for the PC. So Bethesda's okay. Why not just make them official so you don't download an accidental virus for your computer? Why not just download them completely from our site, test it out and everything? They might be buggy, but hey, they're not going to destroy your computer or your Skyrim saves or install.
I think they did the same thing with Grand Theft Auto.
That and Fallout as well. Fallout, same thing. So, mods, some companies have embraced it and actually sold a lot of Skyrim copies for PC because of that modding. People wanted to keep playing it even after all the official, gameplay was done. So, modding it, definitely helped there. But, yeah, we're getting way off topic. We're talking about mods and everything, etc., etc. But the original question, what happens in the 240p Club? But the original question, I believe, was... What was the original question about the Dreamcast?
I think had we moved on yet from the Sega Do What Nintendo?
Yeah, to the Dreamcast. Yeah, the 32-bit wars really would have started a whole lot earlier had Genesis fell apart. Maybe, who knows, the 3DO may have gained market traction. But since we were talking about the 32-bit wars, Sony had a deal with Nintendo to produce a CD-ROM in response for the Sega CD, which the Sega CD turned out to be pretty popular, but it was, a lot of good titles came out for it. Again, though, it was not as successful as the Genesis, because the Sega Genesis became pretty affordable towards the middle of the 16-bit wars. You could get one for $129.99 with a pack entitled. Usually it was Sonic 2. That you were buying games for pretty cheap there. The game titles, like most of them were pretty cheap. I mean, Phantasy Star 4 was like $100 for the cartridge, but that was a massive RPG. Well, massive at the time, so that was to be expected.
Yeah, I mean, you can find your Sonic for about about $40 to $50 at that point.
It was, software was pretty easily had for the system, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, again, we're getting off topic. Nintendo, in response, due to market pressure, wanted to market their own CD-ROM system. Of course, being Nintendo, they wanted to do it on their own terms, so they approached Sony, who had produced a couple good games for the Super Nintendo, including Joe and Mac, I believe. They did the adaptation of Hook, the movie Hook, for Nintendo Super NES. I don't believe it was very good, but they did it. Yeah, so they had a working relationship with Nintendo, so they decided, hey, and actually the sound chip in the NES, the Super Nintendo, was Sony made. So Sony's like, okay, we'll get into the computing industry. We'll design a CD-ROM. And they did. It turned out to be the Nintendo PlayStation. It was named PlayStation back in the day. PlayStation just didn't come later on, which you found out in many magazines at the time. You see the word PlayStation, it's like, wait a minute, this was published in '93. What's going on here? But anyway, Nintendo messed up, did another deal with Philips, and wound up, angering Sony to the point where, hey, we're going to get revenge. We did talk about this in Podcast 1, actually, about the Nintendo, we briefly went into it. The Nintendo PlayStation was no more. There was a single prototype somewhere in the world that was unearthed 2 years ago, which was fantastic. But it was non-functional. I think someone had to put some custom firmware on it to even get it to work. But then Nintendo double dealt with Philips. Philips had to sue, etc. I think one of the results was they wound up getting planned Mario title on their CDI system and 2 out-of-canon Zelda games on their CDI system.
Oh dear, we don't talk about those.
Yeah, we've mentioned that many times, of course.
Yeah, they're really bad.
They were bad.
The cool thing was you got a playable Zelda in one of them at least, but...
Yeah, but again, we're going into, but what if that never happened? What if Nintendo did right by Sony? The PlayStation, as we know, it never came out. It was a peripheral for the Super Nintendo.
Oh, would Sony or would Sony or PlayStation exist as it is now?
And would they be overtaking the Sega Saturn? That would be the question. Would a combination of those two systems be overtaking?
That's a good question.
Can you imagine if you had this system? I have a feeling Square would have never left.
Yeah.
Square would have stayed on as developer. Final Fantasy VII would have been for the Nintendo PlayStation. As, But here's the thing, though. That was a 16-bit system.
How do you think Final Fantasy VII would have looked at 16?
It would have looked a whole lot like Final Fantasy VI, I think. Only, except since being on a CD system, you could put all sorts of full motion videos on there. It would have been grainy. It would have been like something akin to the small window, like full motion video of the Sega CD. It would probably have been a little better, but still, it wouldn't have been a high resolution. It would have just been like a small window, you know, and like in the middle of the game. It would have probably looked good. But it still wouldn't have looked like the Final Fantasy VII we know and love from an independent PlayStation. Also, here's the other thing. Well, by that point, Nintendo didn't really care about violence because the video game rating system was in place. This is what we're talking about 94 here, 95. Video game rating system was universal. And Nintendo started to put out some more adult titles, Primal Rage, adult themes.
Oh, that was
Mortal
fun.
Kombat 2 didn't require a blood code for Super Nintendo because it was already in. Sega got in trouble for the game Night Trap, which ironically was made in the 80s. So, we'll be talking about that a little later on. But, video game violence was basically, it hovered every time there was an election year, but at the same time, the big congressional hearings about it were over. They decided on a rating system. So the titles probably would have been the same. I could imagine Twisted Metal and games like Loaded coming out for the Nintendo PlayStation. But here's the thing. What would have happened around 32-bit time?
Ooh. Good question.
The Sega Saturn was out, Nintendo, this Saturn and PlayStation came out around the same time. So Sony was well equipped to compete with the Sega Saturn. Had they remained Nintendo peripheral, Nintendo would have probably tried to squeeze the life out of the system as long as they could. So, they would...
I don't know if they would have been able to compete.
Yeah, they would have been developing the Nintendo, that then known as the Ultra 64. And, where would that leave Sony?
I don't know. It's a good question. They would be kowtowing to the to Nintendo. Do you think they would have wanted to rebel and go out by themselves?
Yeah, that's the question here. Would Sony have gone by themselves, or would they have decided to continue working with Nintendo and being a parts, the parts manufacturer for Nintendo consoles?
We have to also wonder, what was their working, put into the factors, what was their working relationship like? Would it look like they would have wanted to come out on their own, or do you think they would have maintained it?
They probably would have came out on their own, because I think they just teamed up for that system. Because Sony was an independent license. They put out games. Sony Computing put out titles. They for the Super Nintendo. They didn't put out systems until the PlayStation came out. Here's the thing, though. The next generation, the PlayStation 2, the Sega Dreamcast, Nintendo GameCube, had Nintendo stuck out with Sony, would we be seeing a PlayStation 2, or would we be seeing a Nintendo system that looked like the GameCube, but had Sony PlayStation titles on them?
I think it would have been the latter. Definitely. I don't think the PlayStation 2 would exist in its own form.
So it would be like a two-horse race again. It would be Nintendo and Sony going up against Sega. What kind of a world would that be, man? If I had a portal gun for Rick and Morty, go into that dimension and see what would have happened, that would have been fascinating. See the video game history, and also would a third competitor have come out? I know Microsoft put out the Xbox around that time, so you had them
around there.
Would TTI still exist as and put out another peripheral for the another PC engine? Would it be like the
Well, there's always a third competitor at least to come.
You had Microsoft enter this, enter the console race. So Microsoft turned out to be the third competitor at that time. They entered around, there's PlayStation 2, Dreamcast, and once Dreamcast went away, the Xbox kind of took that over. So fascinating what would have happened. Maybe the 3DO would have gone to prominence too. You never know. The 3DO may have evolved to the 4DO. And
Very possible.
yeah, all these what ifs. Speaking of what ifs, actually, we mentioned the Xbox, and one of the companies that manufactures exclusively with Microsoft is Rare. Rare used to be a Nintendo license, and in fact, Rare was the reason Donkey Kong Country exists, because they were scaling stuff for the Nintendo 64 at the time, and they decided to experiment with the technology, creating some of the graphics for it, and scale it down further and further. And hey, wouldn't you know it, it ran on the Super Nintendo. So that's why we have Donkey Kong Country, and he absolutely dropped that gorgeous graphics of that game. That was the selling point of the game. Fortunately, it was a strong platformer. I don't think it would have sold as many titles if it looked a little less pretty, so to speak.
Definitely. I think people are just really happy also to see Donkey Kong again after he made...
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, after
he made an appearance on the Game Boy, like, you
right.
know, which was actually a really cool game, but...
Yeah, Rare was definitely doing, like, something different with their graphics as opposed to other companies.
You had that, Killer Instinct.
Killer Instinct, yeah. Absolutely.
So you had all these titles, but what, you know, Rare started off actually designing game show games. Like, Wheel of Fortune was a Rare production, you know, for NES, Jeopardy, all these, like, Rare did this. I think I'm trying to think what other games they had a few. Like
did they do Clay Fighter? Also,
no,
or was it anyone
I
else?
don't think that was Rare. That was Interplay, I believe.
Oh, that's right.
Interplay did Clay Fighter.
Yep.
Yeah, but yeah, Rare did this like wonderful, you know, these graphical systems, etc. Eventually, wind up like, you know, ditching Nintendo entirely and moving on to the Microsoft Xbox. Now, Ray kind of brought this one up about Rare. What if Rare stayed a Nintendo license?
Yeah, because as we all know, when the GameCube and Xbox launched, they stayed with Nintendo for a little while, released a Star Fox game, and then jumped over to Microsoft. So a lot of the titles that they were working on ended up jumping ship to the competitor, and ended up being kind of unremarkable, according to reviews, mostly. Like, Grabbed by the Ghoulies, Cameo, the latest Banjo-Kazooie game, Nuts and Bolts. I mean, they have their fans and all, but they kind of underwhelmed compared to games like the original Banjo-Kazooie games, Conker's Bad Fur Day, we have Jet Force Gemini. A lot of Nintendo's like most popular in-house games from the Super NES and N64 eras basically were done by Rare, and to see them like suddenly collapse like this after like leaving Nintendo like that, it was really something, man.
What is Rare doing these days?
I believe they're working with the Xbox One.
Well, yeah, still working with Microsoft, but
right.
Are they just a subsidy of Microsoft now, or?
I think so.
I think they have been absorbed into
Microsoft Collective.
Yeah, because I know one of the most recently worked on was the newer Killer Instinct for the Xbox One.
Which is crazy.
They did put out something called Rare Arcade, I think, which is just a compilation of their...
They did, yep.
Old NES through N64 games, like as far back as the original Battletoads.
I believe there was a Battletoad character available in Killer Instinct, if I remember correctly.
There's also going to be one available in Shovel Knight.
Yep.
I didn't hear about the Killer Instinct thing. I might have to.
I have to double check my research again like that. I could have sworn I saw something.
But since we were talking about a what if, what if they stayed with Nintendo? I mean, obviously they would still have access to Nintendo's intellectual properties like Donkey Kong, so...
Yeah, can you imagine what they would do for the Nintendo Switch? I could actually see their hand in Splatoon.
Yeah.
I mean, Nintendo has kind of taken the Donkey Kong franchise into like a new direction from like the Wii onwards, so it's not like...
Well, they had Donkey Konga.
Oh yeah, the Donkey Kong Jungle Beat.
They had and eventually they had Donkey Kong Country Returns, which which of course has its fans and its detractors like anything else. I think people have mostly been arguing that it's not as great as like the original Donkey Kong Country series, but it's still good in its own right.
I have to wonder also, what if Rare would put their hand in Fire Emblem and like kind of made like not like a platformer version of it, but like tried something different with the franchise.
I think that really, when Fire Emblem came out, it was, I think, more of a nod to like the style popularized by Shining Force series. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if Rare would have really done anything with that, but I could see them doing a spin-off like action platformer type.
Yeah, I mean, the only one who's doing anything somewhat different from Fire Emblem is Koei right now, so they're doing like a Fire Emblem Musou now. So
oh wow!
I would get the game if it wasn't coming out, like if it hasn't already come out, if it's not coming out like tomorrow or like this weekend or something. But I don't like the roster, so I'm gonna pass on that right now. I mean, they're gonna be putting out like DLC packs of like each like classic legendary packs or whatever, but
Speaking of coming out, between our last podcast and this podcast, and we do apologize for the delay, real life happens.
Yeah.
The SNES Classic hit the market, and apparently they came out with a whole boatload more systems this time around. So Nintendo finally got a little bit wiser, but it's still hard to find. Granted, the Switch was hard to find for a while, but then Nintendo finally rectified that eventually. So here's the thing. One of the strongest selling points of the SNES Classic was finally an official release of Star Fox 2.
Woohoo!
Which came out 95% complete beta over the internet. You can find it, on your favorite ROM site. However, Nintendo finally put an official copy out for this system that plays on the original SNES hardware. No emulation. This is an actual SNES hardware, done to the T. So, here's the what if Star Fox 2 actually came out, say, around 94, 95?
You have to wonder also how many people were still interested in Star Fox at this point.
Yeah, the shooter genre kind of deteriorated a bit to the point where, because it was overtaken, people had PCs at the time, they were seeing what was happening with Wolfenstein 3D, what eventually happened with Doom, what eventually happened with Quake. And it's like, okay, we could... And Descent, actually, that was another fun title. Like, that's forgotten nowadays, but back in the day, Descent was, like, crazy, because you had the shooter genre, then you had the first-person shooter genre, which they combined, you were inside a ship, and the ship could go upside down, basically. You're fighting in every direction, tilted 180 degrees, the room spinning, this, that. It was basically Doom for... in the first-person shooter. It was basically shooter in first-person shooter form. Let's put it that way.
Well, just thinking about it gives me a headache.
Yeah. Oh, it was cool back in the day. Especially, 95, getting a PC, seeing this. It was unreal.
Duke Nukem, for one?
Oh, yeah, you had Duke Nukem as well. But yeah, that was the thing. The shooter genre, or the flight sims, genre, were either evolving into realistic flight sims, or, the shooter genre was basically going away. The last commercially successful shooter was Darius Grayed for the Sega Saturn. It was a launch title. It was decent. It went away just as quickly.
If we're talking about space shooters and shoot 'em ups, I think they're still around in the traditional format, but it's kind of a niche market nowadays. And of course, there's this whole genre of it called bullet hell, Danmaku, or whatever. With games like Ikaruga and Toho that are just really difficult, and just 95% of the screen is filled with bullets. So yeah. There's not really much left to do with the genre.
Yeah, it was a limited genre to begin with. Honestly, the only reason why it might be making a return is because, again, everything old is new again. Mm-hmm. Since they're we're doing a retro podcast talking about retro games and retro releases, and the shooters, of course, were definitely due. Some developer out there would design another shooter, because people grew up with them and remembered them.
Yeah, people definitely, like we said, like we all grew up with Star Fox also. But it's kind of one of those games where it's like, okay, so once you've done everything, there's not really much else to do.
Yeah,
it didn't have much replay value other than you did the 3 scenarios.
You got to think about it though. This and this is scheduled to come out what year? I'd say 94 or 95.
Perhaps so, because at that point they were building technology for the 64.
Yeah, but the 16-bit wars are still around. I mean, Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn didn't come out till late 95. And not everyone bought them at launch, of course. So, well into 1996, the 16-bit wars were still going, really. So, imagine this is coming out early 95, late 94-ish, around the time Donkey Kong Country was out, and the replay value around that is finding all the secrets, like, getting the good ending. Mega Man X was out, Super Metroid was out, all these, like, Nintendo's most classic titles ever. Super Mario World 2, I should say, Yoshi's Island, that was out, around 95. So you figure Star Fox 2 probably would have been, like, the bastard stepchild, Like, it would have been released, to some fanfare, would have got some advertising, but it probably would have...
It probably would have fizzled, like, almost immediately.
Yeah. It probably would have still been popular today. People would have hunted it down and replayed it, but, this released for the SNES Classic, it's like, oh my god, a lost game, where so much time has passed since the original came out, and Star Fox 64 and all that.
And of course, with the whole re-releasing of Star Fox 64, releasing Star Fox again on the 3DS, basically, and then also putting characters like Fox McCloud and Falco Lombardo on the and Super Smash Brothers, so that definitely helped the franchise.
Absolutely. It definitely brought some renewed interest into the franchise. That's the fun part, though. Like,
Of course, yeah, they put out a game like Smash Brothers, they put, like, characters you wouldn't see anywhere else or any other time in there, and then that makes, like, new fans come in and look for the games that these characters have been part of.
Yeah.
So.
Alright, I think we're just about out of what-if topics here.
I got one more.
Well, okay.
What if The Legend of Zelda 2 was not a side-scroller?
Interesting. Considering I'm actually playing through the first one right now, but the second one is on the table for retro achievements. If you're not unfamiliar with retro achievements, basically, you play through one of their emulators, like some of these titles, and it comes up with a bunch of achievements, just like modern games. Like, you do something in the game, you get a trophy, pops up. In this case, you get points. They're not considered trophies, but, basically for certain achievements in some of these games. So it makes it interesting because you're playing these games a different way. Like, I just blasted through the original Zelda First Quest pretty easily, but this, the retro achievements is making this interesting because, certain rooms you have certain challenges. It's like, oh great, I gotta do this, or I gotta do this, I gotta do this. Zelda 2 is coming up, actually, and I'm looking forward to playing that again, but can you imagine that not being a side-scroller? Can you imagine that being very similar to the first Zelda?
I don't know.
What kind of... Nintendo was definitely looking to put something new out, hence why, again, they never released Super Mario Bros. 2 here. They released it as the Lost Levels years later, but they never released it here for the NES. So, you gotta wonder, would they have done the same thing to Zelda 2? Would it have been different enough where it would warrant a release, or... would we, as gamers, never see it until a special edition came out?
That is a good question. I brought it up and I don't even got the answer for that.
This is like where you're thinking the what if. The theory I have about this one, I have a feeling it would have looked just like Zelda 1, and it would eventually have come out, but probably in a reformatted version for the Super Nintendo.
Yeah, probably as like a,
again, like similar to what they did with the Lost Levels.
Yeah, pretty much. Like if they would have done like a Zelda collection or like, yeah, I guess like a Zelda All-Stars kind of collection.
Here's the thing, though. We've never actually, and I don't really know if it's because of licensing or whatever, The BS satellite, in Japan it was pretty popular. It never really reached us here, but that gave us a couple different Zelda titles, including a reworking of the original Legend of Zelda, which was interesting. Things would have locked depending on what time of day you're playing. Of course, in the emulator, things are hacked now, so it's simulating like getting new content, etc. But we've never ever seen that game here. Like, the only way to play it is through pretty illegal means.
Mm-hmm.
So
ways that we don't condone.
Yeah, we don't condone or deny them.
Mm-hmm.
Let's put it that way.
Yeah, yeah.
But they never released that here. And it's like, apparently Nintendo does have a bunch of these aces up their sleeve of titles we've never seen. That, we probably never will see here. But you gotta wonder if Zelda 2 would have went that direction, and would that have made Zelda 3 that much more popular, or would it have made it less popular because, hey, Zelda has been around in forever, it was one of those lost franchises? It would be like releasing a Kid Icarus game for Super Nintendo, which never happened.
It's a good question. Do you think people would have been Zelda'd out? Do you think they would have been so turned off by 2 that they wouldn't even want to move on to 3?
Well, no, they wouldn't have even played 2.
Right.
It would have never been here. So they have the original Zelda, which was an unadulterated classic, had a cartoon, etc., but they never marketed, if they never released Part 2, it's like the marketing would have fizzled. Right. No one would be aware of Part 3 when that came out, which would indeed be Part 2 in this country.
Yep.
If Final Fantasy was anything to do.
Oh, no.
So all these questions are basically making me glad things happened the way they did, and we wound up with a bunch of killer Zelda titles, including 2. I will defend 2 because it was an awesome game. We also wound up with a fantastic Sega Genesis system. Star Fox 2 is fascinating now. That came out for this SNES Classic. People are interested. Atari didn't make any mistakes towards the NES. Rare is absorbed into the Microsoft licenses. And Genesis indeed did what Nintendon't.
Woo!
And that just leaves me with one more question. What if we lived in a world where there was another Mega Man game?
Oh, man.
You know what? It's bound to happen eventually. This is one of the franchises that...
Rip my heart out, man.
Sorry. We got
Not like I have one to begin with.
Your heart turned to dust long ago, Nikki.
Yes, it did.
So, anyway, hopefully...
Capcom gets her head out of their
yeah,
asses.
Hopefully Infa King is out there listening. Inafune, you're listening. You're not listening. I don't know.
No, you're probably not.
But hopefully Capcom decides, hey, we need to make another one of these. And soon, look at what happened to Mega Man 10. It was great. It sold a lot. Let's do another one.
Mega Man number 11.
Maybe. Anyway, alright, well, what else do we have to cover this week? Last but not least, we talked about the SNES Classic coming out. Apparently, Night Trap is getting a re-release for a 30th anniversary. Not a 30th anniversary, was it? It was 31 years, actually, because the game's been around since 1986. Although it wasn't released until 1992. I will be talking about that sometime this week on the website. Actually, I'm planning on writing a nice little blog entry, so that will be a bonus incentive to check out the 240pclub.com websites, soon to be redesigned. Also, facebook.com/240pclub, and our Twitter at 240pclub. Now, I left one out, our Twitch. Why did we leave out our Twitch? Because since we've been so busy, we've been kind of inactive. So, this falls to you people out there listening. Comment on our Facebook, on our Twitter, tweet us. What do you want to see us play on Twitch?
Yeah, just let us know.
Let us know out there.
Also, happy 25th anniversary to Mortal Kombat.
Mortal Kombat released Mortal Monday, September 13th. I do remember that in 1993.
Yep, that was a good time.
I still have a video game magazine sitting near my toilet because, I like to read stuff when I'm doing my thing.
Everybody needs to know that.
Yeah, but that's okay. It's a common sentiment.
It is.
And yeah, it's actually the September 1993 edition. It had the blood code in it for the first time, and it had a preview of Mortal Kombat. Mm-hmm. Yes. So happy
Good times.
25th birthday, Mortal Kombat.
Woo!
Actually, Mortal Kombat, that's 24. Because for home consoles, it's 24 years old.
Yeah.
For the arcade, it's 25.
25.
Yes.
It's close enough.
Yes. So, anyway, from all of us at the 240p Club, I'm Metallic Joe.
Yo, I'm Nikki.
I'm Ray. I didn't talk much this time.
Oh, no, you had a nice little soliloquy about Rare.
You did.
We appreciated it.
Mm-hmm. It was very rare.
Yes. We're still punny.
Yay!
Anyway, see y'all next time.
See ya.